My son Daniel thought I was a poor woman. He had no idea I had been quietly earning $40,000 every single month for the last 18 years. He never asked and I never offered. So when he called me one evening and said his wife's parents wanted to meet me over a Sunday lunch, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear. Curiosity. I decided I was going to walk into that house wearing my oldest dress and my most broken shoes. I wanted to see exactly what kind of people my son had married into. And what I discovered that afternoon shook everyone at that table in a way none of them expected. But before I tell you what happened, let me tell you who I am. Because my son Daniel, who is 33 years old, has spent his whole life believing his mother was just a quiet, unremarkable woman. He saw me wake up before sunrise every morning. He saw me carry a worn-out brown bag to work. He saw me buy groceries from the cheapest shelf, patch up old curtains instead of buying new ones, and walk to the bus stop in the rain because I said the taxi was too expensive. None of that was a lie. It also was not the whole truth. The whole truth was this. My name is Grace. I am 58 years old. And for nearly 2 decades, I have been the chief financial officer of a regional healthcare company that operates across 4 states. I oversee a budget larger than most people will ever see in their lifetime. I sit in boardrooms where million-dollar decisions are made before lunch. I have negotiated contracts that changed the lives of thousands of employees. I have been featured in industry publications and invited to speak at conferences. And I have never, not once, told my son any of this. Why not? Because I watched what money does to people. I grew up with nothing. My mother scrubbed other people's floors and my father drove a delivery truck. And they were some of the most dignified people I have ever known. When I started earning real money in my late 30s, I made a choice. I would not let wealth change who I was. I would not raise a son who expected things to be handed to him. I would not become the kind of woman who needed gold jewelry and expensive handbags to feel valuable. So I kept living exactly as I always had. Same small house with the creaky front porch. Same 10-year-old car in the driveway. Same discount store clothes folded neatly in the same wooden dresser. The money went into investments and savings and a few quiet charities that will never know my last name. Daniel grew up believing that his mother was a mid-level office administrator who barely kept the lights on. He was proud of me, he said, for working so hard with so little. And I smiled and let him think that. Until the phone rang one Tuesday night and everything shifted. Daniel sounded nervous in a way that reminded me of when he was 7 years old and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball. "Mom," he said, "Priscilla's parents are coming to town this weekend. They want to do a family lunch on Sunday at their daughter's home. They've heard about you and they want to meet you." "That's lovely," I said. He paused for too long. "I already told them a little about you, Mom. I told them you work in an office and that you live simply and that you're very humble and low-key." There it was. That word, simple, kept my voice perfectly steady. "Course, Daniel. I'll be there Sunday." Hung up the phone. I sat in the middle of my living room in complete silence for almost 3 full minutes. I was not angry. I was not even hurt. I was focused. Because in that single phone call, my son had told me everything I needed to know. He had already decided to apologize for me before I had even walked through the door. He had already told his wife's parents that I was not much, that I was just a simple woman, that I was the kind of mother you mention quickly, and then move on from. And so I decided that I would be exactly that. For one afternoon, I would be exactly the woman he had described. I would show up looking like someone life had worn down completely. And I would watch very carefully how Priscilla's family treated a woman they believed had nothing. I have spent 20 years watching people in boardrooms reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching. This was no different. Sunday morning I went to the back of my wardrobe and pulled out a faded floral blouse. That was at least 12 years old and slightly too big for me now. I paired it with a plain navy skirt that had a small fray at the hem. I found my oldest pair of flat shoes, the beige ones with the scuffed toes that I had kept meaning to throw away. No earrings. No necklace. No perfume. I pulled my gray-streaked hair into a simple bun and fastened it with a plain black elastic band. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. I looked tired. I looked like a woman who had spent her whole life working hard and arriving at old age with very little to show for it. I looked forgettable. Perfect. I called a regular cab, not my usual car service. Paid cash. When I arrived at the address Daniel had sent me, I stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the house before ringing the bell. It was a beautiful home. Large, modern, freshly painted white with black trim. There were 2 brand new cars in the driveway. Polished. Expensive. The kind of cars bought to be seen, not just driven. The garden was perfectly manicured. A small stone fountain sat near the front door. I adjusted my old bag on my shoulder and rang the bell. Daniel answered the door first. When he saw me, his face moved through several expressions in less than 2 seconds. Surprise. Discomfort. Then a quick, forced smile. "Mum, you came." "Course I came." I stepped inside and looked around. The house was beautifully decorated. Marble floors, high ceilings, abstract paintings on the walls, crystal vases filled with white orchids. My daughter-in-law Priscilla appeared from around the corner. She wore a perfectly fitted ivory blouse and slim trousers. Her hair was blown out and smooth. Her jewelry was minimal but clearly expensive. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that barely made contact with my skin. "Grace, so wonderful to finally meet you." Her smile was the smile of a woman who had been rehearsing it. Then her parents came out from the living room and I understood immediately what I was walking into. Her mother, Claudette, was a tall woman in her early 60s wearing a silk blouse and wide-leg trousers in deep burgundy. Her watch was gold. Her earrings were diamond. She carried herself with a deliberate ease of someone who has spent decades practicing how to make other people feel smaller just by entering a room. Her father, Roland, stood beside her in a pressed linen blazer and dark trousers. Silver-haired, square-jawed. He had the look of a man who had never been told no and had no plans to start hearing it now. He looked at me the way people look at furniture they are deciding whether or not to keep. Claudette extended her hand. "Grace, we have heard about you." Her voice was smooth and warm the way expensive coffee is smooth. "Does not mean it will not burn you." Roland gave me a brief handshake. The kind that says I am doing this because manners require it and nothing more. We sat down in the dining room. The table was set beautifully. Fine china. Crystal glasses. A centerpiece of fresh-cut flowers. A catered lunch was already laid out in warming dishes along the sideboard. It was clear that no expense had been spared for this gathering. And just as clearly it was not for my benefit. Claudette took control of the conversation immediately. She asked about the drive over. I said I took a cab. I noticed her and Roland exchanged the briefest of glances. Just a flicker. But I caught it the way you catch a match being struck in a dark room. Daniel tried to steer the conversation toward safe topics. His work. A recent trip he and Priscilla had taken. The neighborhood. But Claudette had an agenda, and she was not going to be redirected for long. "So Grace," she said, settling back in her chair with the confidence of someone who owns the room they are sitting in, "tell us about yourself. What do you do?" I looked down at my plate with the practiced shyness of a woman unaccustomed to being asked about herself at a table this fine. "Oh, I work in an office. Administrative things. Filing, scheduling, that sort of thing. Nothing very exciting." Claudette smiled. "How lovely. It's honest work. And have you been there long?" "Many years," I said. "Keeps me busy." Roland lifted his wine glass. "Stability is important," he said with the tone of a man giving a small compliment to a child for tying their shoes correctly. Claudette nodded along. "Course. Although it is always good to have goals, to aspire to more, to think about what comes next." She said this while looking directly at me, making sure I understood that she was not simply offering philosophy. She was measuring the gap between us and inviting me to feel the distance. I nodded slowly and said nothing, because silence is the best mirror. When you say nothing, people fill the space with exactly who they are. And Claudette did not disappoint. She began talking about herself. She told me about the 3 properties she and Roland owned. A primary residence in an upscale suburb, a lake house 2 hours north, and a condominium downtown that they used when they did not feel like making the drive. She said this the way other people talk about buying milk. Casually. Deliberately casually. Roland mentioned that he had recently semi-retired from his import-export business and was now on the advisory board of 2 companies. He said this without being asked. Claudette mentioned that they had just returned from a month in Portugal and were considering purchasing a small property there. She asked if I had traveled. I said I had not been outside the country. She tilted her head with what I can only describe as sympathetic condescension. Oh well, travel broadens the mind. Perhaps someday. I said yes, perhaps someday. And I let her have it. Because I knew that the longer I stayed quiet, the more she would reveal. And she was revealing a great deal. Priscilla sat beside Daniel and contributed very little to the conversation. She laughed at appropriate moments and refilled glasses and kept her eyes mostly on her plate whenever her mother said something particularly sharp. Daniel was doing the same thing he always did when he was uncomfortable. He ate too quickly and smiled too widely and changed the subject every time there was a pause long enough to feel dangerous. But Claudette was not finished. She turned to me again during the main course. Grace, she said, I want to ask you something and please tell me if I am being too forward. Go ahead, I said. She set down her fork. Daniel tells us that you live alone. That things have been modest since he was young. She paused just long enough for the weight of that word, modest, to land. Does he look after you? Do you manage all right on your own? There it was. Dressed up in concern. Rapped in a soft voice. But what she was really asking was this. Are you a burden? Are you the kind of problem that might complicate our daughter's life? Are you going to need things from these young people that they cannot afford to give? I clasped my hands on the table and smiled gently. I manage perfectly well, I said. I have always been independent. I don't ask much from Daniel. She nodded with visible relief. That is admirable, she said. Truly. Because young couples need space to build their lives without obligations pulling them in too many directions. She looked at Roland and he nodded as though she had just said something deeply wise. Daniel put his fork down. He looked like he wanted to say something. But he did not. And that was when I felt the sadness arrive. Not anger. Sadness. Because my son, who I had raised to be strong, to be honest, to be kind, was sitting at this table letting these people diminish his mother and saying nothing. He was choosing comfort over truth. He was choosing to keep the peace in his marriage at the cost of his own integrity. And so I kept playing the role. I kept my eyes soft and my voice small and my posture apologetic. And I waited. Claudette moved on. She began talking about the wedding that Priscilla and Daniel had. She said it with the practiced delicacy of someone who wants to take credit without appearing to take credit. We gave them a very beautiful start, she said. The reception venue, the honeymoon, the furniture for their first apartment. We believe in giving our children a real foundation. She looked at me. Not unkindly, but with meaning. Were you able to contribute to any of that, Grace? Or was it not possible at the time? Roland said nothing. But he was watching me. I lowered my eyes. I gave them a small gift. Whatever I could manage. Claudette made a soft sound. Course. Every contribution matters, no matter the size. The intention is what counts. She said this as though granting me mercy. As though I should be grateful she was not pressing the point. And I thought about how much I had quietly deposited into Daniel's account 3 weeks before his wedding without telling him where it came from. I thought about the investment account I had set up in his name when he was 12 years old, the one he would inherit someday and still knew nothing about. I thought about the medical bills I had paid for his emergency appendix surgery 4 years ago when he had no insurance and thought he had handled it with a payment plan. He had. My payment plan. I said none of this. Ate my lunch. I smiled when smiled at. I let Claudette refill my water glass for me as though I were a fragile guest who needed tending. And when Roland began talking about his investment portfolio over dessert and asked if I had any savings, any retirement plan, anything set aside, I said I had a little. I hoped it would be enough. Roland sighed in the way of a man who has heard this story too many times. It's never too late to start, he said. Even small amounts add up. He then spoke for 4 straight minutes about compound interest, as though he had just invented the concept. Claudette nodded through every word. Daniel stared at the tablecloth. Priscilla arranged and rearranged her dessert spoon. And I sat there thinking about the investment portfolio I had personally built over 2 decades, which now held more than 3 times what Roland had casually mentioned his entire business was worth. After dessert, we moved to the sitting room. Coffee was served. The conversation turned lighter. Claudette showed me photos from Portugal on her phone, the harbor town, the ceramic tiles, the fish market at sunrise. Beautiful, I said. She seemed pleased. Roland asked Daniel about a project at work and they talked for a while. Priscilla sat beside me. This was the first time we had been even slightly separated from the group. She was nervous. I could feel it in the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, even though it was not particularly heavy. She said quietly, "I hope today was nice for you, Grace." "It was lovely," I replied. She nodded. Didn't quite believe me but did not push. Then she said something that I thought about for a long time afterward. "My parents are very proud people," she said. "They just want to make sure that everything is right. That things are stable. That Daniel and I have a strong base." "I understand," I said. And I did understand. I understood exactly what she meant. She meant that her parents had been measuring me since the moment I walked through the door. And she had let them. Roland called across the room in that pleasant but pointed way of his. "So Grace, what do you think about the neighborhood? A bit out of the way for you to visit often, I imagine. Getting here on public transport must be quite the journey." I looked up at him. The afternoon light was coming through the large windows behind him, and it caught the silver of his watch. I said the cab ride was perfectly manageable. He smiled. "Course. Although it might become inconvenient over time." Claudette added, "We always say that family must not become a burden on each other's routines." There it was again. Burden. That word was doing a lot of work today. I set my coffee cup down on its saucer. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at Claudette. Then Roland. Then Priscilla. Then finally at my son, who was studying the pattern on the rug as though it held the solution to a very complicated problem. And then I spoke. But not with the small, careful voice I had been using all afternoon. My real voice. The one I use in boardrooms. The one that does not apologize for taking up space. I said, "You know, Claudette, you've used that word a few times today. Burden. It's interesting." Claudette blinked. "I only meant," she started. "I know what you meant," I said. "I've known what you meant since about 15 minutes into lunch." She straightened slightly. "I'm not sure what you are suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied. "I'm simply going to stop pretending." Everyone in the room went still. Daniel looked up from the rug. Priscilla set down her coffee. Roland watched me with narrowed eyes. I reached into my old brown bag and pulled out my phone. I opened my work email and turned the screen toward Claudette. She could see the company letterhead. Name. My title. Chief Financial Officer. She looked at it without speaking. I let her look. Then I said, "I earn $40,000 a month. I have earned something close to that for the past 18 years. I own my home outright. Have no debt. I have a retirement portfolio that a skilled wealth manager oversees. I have investments in 4 industries. I do not take cabs because I cannot afford cars. I take cabs today because I wanted to see something." Claudette set her coffee cup down very carefully. Roland said nothing. The room was completely silent except for the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere outside. Daniel said, "Mom. Just my name. Nothing after it. Just my name," in a voice that held about 20 different feelings all colliding at once. I looked at him. I said, "I'm sorry I never told you, Daniel. Truly. You will understand why I didn't when we talk later. But right now I need to finish something." I looked back at Claudette. I said, "I came here today dressed this way on purpose. I wanted to see how you would treat a woman you believed was struggling. Whether the kindness would be real or whether it would be pity wrapped up in silk. I think we all know which one it was." Claudette said, "That is a very dramatic accusation." "Is it?" Yes. Because you asked me 3 separate times in the last 2 hours whether I could manage on my own. You suggested that visiting your daughter would be inconvenient for me. You told me that travel broadens the mind, as though I were a child who had never considered leaving the block. Roland said we were simply making conversation. I looked at him. Were you? Or were you calculating the risk of your daughter being connected to a woman you had already decided was beneath your family's standards? Roland's jaw tightened. This is not a boardroom. No, I agreed. It's worse. In a boardroom, people at least admit what they are doing. Priscilla stood up. She looked at her parents, then at me, then at Daniel. Her face had gone the color of the white orchids on the table. She said, I didn't know. I turned to her. I know you didn't, I said. And that matters. But you did know something was wrong, Priscilla. You felt every sharp comment your mother made and you said nothing. You heard the questions about whether I was a burden and you refilled the water glasses. Silence in the face of unkindness is not neutrality. It is a choice. Tears came to her eyes quickly. She did not try to blink them away. Daniel stood up then. He looked at his in-laws and his voice was very quiet but very clear. He said, I owe my mother an apology. She should never have had to walk in here feeling like she needed to be smaller than she is. I told you she was simple. And what I really meant was that I was afraid you wouldn't approve of her. And that was wrong. It was a betrayal of the most important person in my life. His voice broke just slightly on the last word. Claudette said, Daniel, we never asked you to apologize for your family. We only want what is best. For Priscilla, he said. He looked at her directly. But what about what is best for the people Priscilla chose? Roland held up his hand. I think emotions are running a little high. Let's all take a breath. I looked at Roland. I said, I'm perfectly calm, Roland. I've been calm all afternoon. What you are seeing is not emotion. This is just honesty. And I know that can feel jarring if you're not used to it. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recalculation. He was a businessman. He understood when the terms of a negotiation had changed. Continued. I did not come here to humiliate anyone. I came to understand who my son had married into. That is a reasonable thing for a mother to want to know. What I found was a family that judges people by what they own. I also found a daughter-in-law who, at her core, I think is better than the lessons she was taught. I hope I'm right about that. Priscilla made a sound that was halfway between a breath and a sob. She sat back down. She looked at her mother. She said, Mom. Just that word. Just Mom. But it carried everything. Claudette looked at her daughter and for the first time all afternoon, the armor cracked. Just slightly. Just around the edges. She said, Priscilla, I only want for you to have security. I know, Priscilla said. But you also taught me to be kind. And I don't think I was kind today. I let things happen that I should have stopped. The room held that for a moment. Nobody spoke. Outside, the lawnmower had stopped. There was just the sound of the afternoon settling around us. Daniel came and sat beside me on the sofa. He took my hand. He said, I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry. I put my other hand over his. You don't need to keep saying it, I told him. Just understand why I'm telling you this now. Because for 18 years, I protected you from knowing about the money because I wanted you to build your own strength. Your own foundation. I did not want you growing up leaning on mine. He nodded slowly. He squeezed my hand. Understand, he said. I think I'm only starting to understand a lot of things today. Roland cleared his throat. He looked at me with an expression that I could not entirely read. He said, Grace, I think I owe you an apology. I looked at him without helping him along. He said, I made assumptions. We both did. He glanced at Claudette. The way we spoke today was not how I would choose to speak to someone if I had known. He stopped. He seemed to be wrestling with the end of that sentence because he could hear, I think, how it sounded. If I had known what you were worth. If I had known about the money. He could not finish it cleanly because there was no clean way to finish it. I said, if you had known what I earned, you would have been warmer. I understand that. But what I need you to hear is that the woman who deserved warmth was the same woman who walked in here 2 hours ago. The one with the old shoes and the canvas bag. She deserved exactly what you would have given someone you respected. Not because of anything in her bank account. Just because she was a human being who raised your son-in-law and loves him more than anything in this world. Claudette pressed her lips together. Her eyes were very bright. She said, "You're right." Her voice was small in a way I had not heard from her before. She said it again more firmly. "You are right. I let myself be led by the wrong compass today. I don't say that easily. I'm aware of that," I replied. "And I appreciate that you're saying it at all. That is not nothing." Priscilla crossed the room and sat on the arm of her mother's chair. She put her hand on Claudette's shoulder. Claudette reached up and covered it with her own. It was a small gesture, but it was real. Daniel looked at me. He said, "Why did you keep it secret for so long, Mom?" "Really, why?" I thought about how to answer him. I said, "Because I grew up watching my mother clean other people's houses. And she was the most dignified person I knew. She never once made me feel that worth came from money. She taught me that it came from how you treated people when you had nothing to gain. I wanted to give you that same understanding. I wanted it to be something you figured out yourself, not something I told you from behind the safety of a large salary." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You gave me something more valuable than money, Mom. I know that now. I didn't completely understand it before, but I know it now." Claudette looked at me across the coffee table. She said, "You raised a good man, Grace. Whatever else I may have gotten wrong today, I can see that clearly. That means something to me," I said. "Truly. Because he is the thing I am most proud of in this world. Not any number on any account anywhere. Just him." Roland stood up. He walked over to me and extended his hand again. This time the handshake was different. Firm. Present. He looked me in the eye. He said, "I hope we can start over." I shook his hand. Said I'd like that. We should start by never using the word burden again. He let out a short, surprised sound. Almost a laugh. "Almost," he said, agreed. "I think we can manage that." Priscilla crossed to Daniel and leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. She looked at me. She said, "Will you come back? Not to prove anything. Just to visit." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the woman she had been trying to be all afternoon, balancing between her parents and her husband and her own conscience. I thought about how heavy that must be to carry day after day. Said, "Yes, Priscilla. I'll come back. On one condition." She nodded. "Next time I come, we talk about something real. None of this showing off who has what and where. I want to know who you actually are." She smiled. A real smile. The first one I had seen from her all day. She said, "I'd really like that." We sat together for another hour after that. The conversation changed. It became simpler. Claudette told me about growing up in a small town far from anything glamorous. About how her parents had very little and how that had driven her to achieve. About how the fear of returning to that smallness had sometimes made her sharp in ways she was not always proud of. She did not say all of this directly. She said it around the edges. But I heard it clearly. Roland talked about his early business days. The failures before the successes. He was easier to like in those stories. Before I left, Daniel walked me to the front door. He stood on the step beside me while we waited for my cab. He said, "Mom, why today? Why now, after all these years, did you decide to show them?" I looked at the perfectly manicured garden, the stone fountain, the 2 expensive cars. I said, "Because I needed to know, son, whether the family you married into could see the value in someone they believed had nothing. Matters. Not for me. I know who I am. But for you it matters." He nodded slowly. He said, "And what did you find out?" I said, "I found out that they can learn. That's more than I hoped for, if I'm being honest." He laughed a little. It was a tired laugh. A relieved one. He said, "I should have stood up for you sooner." I know I should have. I told him you did stand up. Maybe not as soon as I would have liked. But you stood up. And that is what I'll remember. The cab pulled up. He hugged me for a long time at the door. Longer than usual. The kind of hug that is also an apology. Also a promise. I got into the cab and the driver pulled away and I watched the White House with its perfect garden disappear in the rearview mirror. The driver asked how my afternoon had been. Said eventful. He laughed. Good eventful or bad eventful? Thought about it. I said complicated eventful. The kind that leaves you better than it found you. He nodded. Those are the best ones, he said. The ones that cost you something but give you something back. I looked out the window at the passing streets and thought about what it felt like to not pretend. To not make yourself smaller for anyone. To not walk into a room rehearsing your apology. I thought about my mother scrubbing floors at 5 in the morning with more dignity than anyone in that beautiful dining room had shown all afternoon. And I thought she knew. She always knew. That the measure of a person is not what they can show you. It is what they show you when they think you have nothing. The cab moved through the late afternoon light and I felt something settle in me. Quietness. The kind that comes after you have said a true thing and do not regret it. Got home a little after 4. My house was small and warm and utterly mine. Made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat 1,000 times before. The same chips in the edge of the mug. The same view out the window to the neighbor's oak tree. Nothing had changed here. Everything was exactly as I had left it. And yet I felt as though I was sitting in it differently. As though some weight I had carried for a long time without noticing had finally been set down. My phone rang. It was Daniel. Answered. He said I just needed to call. Just to hear your voice. I said I'm here. He said I called Priscilla's mom after you left. I wanted to follow up on what you said. About kindness having nothing to do with what someone owns. She said she wanted to apologize to you properly. Someday when it feels right. I said that was fine. That I would be glad to hear it when she was ready. He said, "Are you okay, Mom?" Really? I looked at the oak tree through the window. Its branches were just beginning to show the first signs of spring. I said, "I'm better than okay, Daniel. I'm honest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know how much I needed to see that today. To see you just be exactly who you are without apologizing for it. I've been apologizing for myself to the wrong people for years, Mom. I realized that today." I said, "That's the work, son. Figuring out when you've been making yourself smaller and deciding to stop." He said, "I'm going to do better." Said, "I know. You already have." After we hung up, I sat for a little while longer at the kitchen table. I thought about Claudette and her bright eyes when she admitted she was wrong. I thought about Roland and his recalibrated handshake. I thought about Priscilla with her hands clasped around her coffee cup, trying to hold her loyalties together without dropping any of them. They were not bad people. I believed that. They were people who had let fear become a compass. Fear of smallness. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being mistaken for ordinary. I knew that fear. I had just chosen a different response to it. I chose to let the ordinary be where my dignity lived. The next morning was a Monday. I was at my desk before 8. 3 meetings by 10. Financial review at noon. Call with our board at 2. Everything exactly as it always was. My assistant brought me coffee. The same coffee from the same place in the same white cup. She said good morning. Said good morning back. She asked how my weekend had been. I said it was one of the more interesting ones in recent memory. She raised an eyebrow and smiled. I smiled back and opened my calendar. Life continued. As it always does. Moving forward on its own quiet current. Carrying us along whether we have figured things out or not. 3 days passed. On Wednesday afternoon, I received a handwritten note in the mail. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy. Good stationery. I recognized Claudette's handwriting from the place cards at the lunch. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single card with these words written in a careful, deliberate hand. Dear Grace, I have spent 2 days thinking about Sunday. About what I would tell you if I could do it again. What I keep arriving at is very simple, and I have never been someone who finds simplicity easy. So here it is. I was unkind to a woman who deserved better. Not because of what she owned or did not own. Just because she was there and she was a person. I'm sorry for that. I hope someday we can sit at a table again and I can do better. With respect, Claudette. I read it twice. Then I set it on the corner of my desk where I would be able to see it. Not because I needed to remember the apology, but because I wanted to remember that people can surprise you. That the woman who tilted her head at me over dessert and said oh well, perhaps someday about travel, could also sit down with herself and write a genuine sentence. That is not nothing. That is actually everything. Means change is possible. Even in people who have spent decades building walls out of wealth and winning. Even in them. 2 weeks after that Sunday, Priscilla called me. She said, "Would you like to have coffee with me sometime? Just us. No occasion. No parents. No performance." I said I would like that very much. We met the following Saturday at a small cafe near her work. She arrived first. I saw her through the window before I went in. She was sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around her mug. The same way she had held her coffee cup on Sunday. But her face was different. She looked less rehearsed. Less arranged. I went in. She stood up. We hugged a little awkwardly at first and then more warmly. We sat across from each other and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I don't know exactly where to start." I said, "Then start anywhere." She took a breath. She said, "I knew on Sunday, probably within the first 30 minutes, that something was wrong. That my parents were being unkind. But I kept telling myself to wait. To not make a scene. To get through the afternoon." She looked at her mug. "I've been getting through afternoons my whole life." I said, "I know what that feels like." She looked up. "Do you?" I said, "Before I found my footing professionally, yes. I spent years walking into rooms and deciding in advance that I probably didn't deserve to take up too much space." She nodded slowly. "How did you stop?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I watched what it cost me. Every time I made myself smaller, I paid for it somehow. In how I felt about myself. In the decisions I let others make that should have been mine. Eventually the cost became more than I was willing to keep paying." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I love my parents. I need you to know that." I said, "I do know that. Loving someone and seeing them clearly are not the same thing. You can do both." She said, "My mother grew up with nothing. She's told me about it. About being cold in winter. About going to school with shoes that did not fit. About watching her parents count change on the kitchen table. She worked so hard to get away from that. She built something real." "I know," I said. "I can hear that in her." She said, "But somewhere along the way the fear of going back turned into something else. Into needing to prove something to everyone all the time. And I inherited that, I think. That need. That fear." I said, "Awareness of it is the first step away from it." She smiled carefully. "Daniel says you have a gift for saying things plainly." I laughed. "He thinks that's a gift. He grew up with it as a daily reality." She laughed too. Real laugh. Short and surprised. It changed her face completely. Made her look younger. More herself. We sat in that cafe for almost 2 hours. We talked about her work, which she loved. About Daniel's small habit of leaving cabinet doors open, which she found endlessly maddening. About her childhood and mine. About what we each wanted the next 10 years to look like. She was warm and funny and sharp and honest in ways I had not seen on Sunday. She was the person she was when no one was performing for anyone. Near the end she said, "Grace, I want to be the kind of daughter-in-law who actually knows you. Not just a version of you that is easy to present. The real you. I want Daniel to have his mother in his life fully, not managed from a careful distance." I looked at her across the small cafe table. I said, "I'd like that too, Priscilla. More than you know." On the walk home I thought about how strange life is. How a Sunday afternoon that began as an experiment in disappointment had opened a door I had not expected. I had gone to that house to confirm something. Instead, I had found something more complicated and more interesting. People who were capable of being worse than I had hoped, and also of being better than I had given them credit for. The truth is rarely a single thing. It usually arrives as a collection of things. And you have to be willing to sit with all of them. A month later, Roland called me. He got my number from Daniel. He said, "I hope this isn't an intrusion." Said, "Not at all." He cleared his throat. He said, "I have a meeting next month with our estate planner. And in light of recent conversations, Claudette and I are rethinking some things. About what we passed down. Not just financially. He paused. About what values we have actually built into our family and which ones we may have let slide in favor of things that are easier to count. I said, that sounds like an important conversation to have. He said, I thought you might understand it better than most. I said I might. He said, would you be willing to have coffee sometime? I'd like to hear your perspective on some things. Not financial advice. Just, he paused again, I think you see certain things with a clarity that I have let get cloudy. Said yes. Come. He sounded genuinely relieved. He said, thank you, Grace. I said, thank you for calling, Roland. Take something to make that phone call. He said, I'm learning that being wrong about someone important is its own kind of education. I agreed that it was. I told Daniel about Roland's call that evening. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, are you happy, Mom? Really? Said yes. He said, are you sure? Because you spent 18 years carrying all of this alone. Building all of this quietly. I said I wasn't alone. Had you? He said, that's not the same as having someone who knows you fully. Thought about that. Said, you're right. Maybe I'll work on that. He said, I'll hold you to it. I said, I know you will. That's one of your best qualities. He said, where did I get that from? I said, I genuinely cannot imagine. He laughed. We talked for another hour that night. Not about money. Not about the lunch or what had happened or what anyone had said. We talked about him. About his plans. About something he was building at work that excited him. About a book he was reading. About a dinner he and Priscilla had made together that had gone terribly, and they had ended up eating cereal at midnight. I laughed until my eyes watered at that story. It occurred to me sitting there listening to my son laugh about midnight cereal that this was the thing I had protected all along. Not some number. Not some status. The uncomplicated ease of two people who love each other talking about real life. I had spent 18 years building something quietly and carefully so that he would never have to carry the weight of it. So that he could just be a person. Just live. The money was never the point. It was only ever the tool. He had always been the point. That Sunday, months after the lunch at Priscilla's parents' house, I drove myself to the cemetery where my mother is buried. I do this every few months. I bring her white flowers because she never cared much for roses. They're too expected, she used to say. I stood at her headstone for a long time. The day was gray and quiet. I told her about everything. About Daniel and Priscilla. About Claudette and Roland. About the old floral blouse and the scuffed beige shoes and the look on Claudette's face when she read my job title off my phone screen. I could almost hear my mother laughing. She had a laugh like something falling off a high shelf. Sudden and surprising. She would have found the whole thing deeply satisfying. She would have said see. She always said see. When something confirmed what she already knew about human nature. As if the world was constantly in the process of proving her right and she was graciously allowing it. I said to her headstone, you would have loved how it turned out. I think you would have been proud. The wind moved through the grass and I chose to take that as agreement. On the drive home I thought about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I could. I would tell her this. You do not have to prove anything to anyone who has decided your worth before learning your name. You do not owe your smallness to rooms that make you feel large would be an inconvenience. The people who deserve your real self will recognize it. And the people who only respond to what you can show them on a bank statement were never going to be worth showing anything to in the first place. Walk in. Be exactly who you are. Let the rest sort itself out. Got home. Parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for a moment looking at the small house with the creaky porch. The house I had lived in for 22 years. The house I could have replaced a dozen times over and chose not to because it was mine in the way that things are yours when you have stood in them through everything. I went inside. Made tea. I sat by the kitchen window. The oak tree was full of leaves now. Spring had finished its work and the whole world was green. Thought this is enough. This has always been enough. Not because had nothing, but because I understood the difference between enough and more. More is a moving target. It runs ahead of you no matter how fast you go. Enough is where you plant your feet. It is the ground you build everything on. It is what lets you walk into a room full of people performing their worth and feel completely, entirely calm. 'Cause you already know yours. Not because of what you earn, but because of how you have lived, and who you have loved, and what you have refused to be ashamed of. That is the whole story. That is everything that happened. And when I think about it now, I do not think about the shock on Claudette's face or the way Roland's expensive watch caught the light when he admitted he had been wrong. I think about Daniel standing up at that table, finding his voice a little later than I would have hoped, but finding it. I think about Priscilla in the corner of a cafe with both hands wrapped around a mug, starting to tell me the truth about herself. I think about a woman with a handwritten note and the courage to say, simply, I was unkind and I am sorry. Ordinary moments. Extraordinary things. A few months after all of this, Priscilla told me she was pregnant. Daniel called first, stumbling over his words in that way he does when something feels too big to say simply. Mom, he said, we're going to have a baby. I sat down in the middle of wherever I was standing. I put my hand over my mouth. Then I said, that is the most wonderful news I have ever heard. He laughed. His voice was full. I said, how are you feeling? He said, terrified, delighted, both at the same time. I said, that is exactly how it is supposed to feel. I got to talk to Priscilla afterward. She sounded different, softer in some way, but also more solid, as if something had settled in her when she found out. She said, Grace, I want our child to know you, the real you, from the beginning. No version, no managing, just you. I said, I would like that more than I can say. She said, I want them to know that worth comes from how you live. I want that to be something they grow up understanding. Not something they have to learn the hard way at a lunch table at 30 years old. I laughed. She laughed too. I said, you turned out well, Priscilla. Despite the lunch table. She said, I had a good teacher. I think she meant her mother. I think she also might have meant me. I was glad to take a little of the credit. When we hung up, I sat very still for a long time. I thought about the child that was coming, about what they would see when they looked at the world, about what they would be taught to value, about the questions they would ask and the answers they would be given. I thought about my own mother and her white flowers and her sense that the world was always in the process of proving her right. I thought, I want this child to know that the world tends, eventually, toward honesty, that unkindness does not hold, that the things people use to measure each other dissolve over time and what remains is only how they treated the people in front of them. I want that child to know what their great-grandmother knew, that dignity is not something you earn. It is something you carry. From the very first moment, no matter what room you walk into, no matter what you are wearing, no matter who thinks they have the authority to decide your worth, you carry it, you protect it, you pass it on. That is the inheritance that matters. Not any number, not any property, not any golden watch on any wrist. Just that quiet, unshakable certainty that you are enough. Not because anyone gave you permission to be, but because you decided one ordinary morning that you were. And nobody, no matter how much they have or how high their ceilings are, can take that from you. Not ever. Not if you hold it right. I think that is what I want to leave behind when I am gone. Not any balance in any account. Just the knowledge that I carried it. That I passed it on. That somewhere in the world there is a child growing up who will walk into rooms exactly as they are and feel no need to apologize for it. Because someone before them lived that way first. And showed them how. I am grateful for that Sunday. For the old floral blouse and the scuffed beige shoes. For the look on Claudette's face when she realized what she had done. For Daniel finding his voice at the table. For Priscilla at the cafe with her hands wrapped around a mug. For Roland's revised handshake. For the cream-colored envelope on the corner of my desk. For all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, because they are the parts that taught me something true. That people can be better than their fear. That families can grow in directions no one planned. That a single afternoon, uncomfortable and revelatory, can change the shape of everything that follows. I would not trade it. Not for anything. That is all. That is the whole story. And now it is yours too. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If If you enjoyed this story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I look forward to your comments on the story. On the screen you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect. This is Godfred's Storytime.